Building tall has always been the dream of many old architects. Actually, achieving tall structures was a great feat of engineering. New technologies allowed the skyscraper boom in the 20th century. Suddenly, the records for tallest buildings were broken every couple of years by a new project, mostly in the United States and later in Asia. Europe is not exactly known for its super tall buildings. It started to enter the skyscraper architecture rather late, and due to the general layout and history of its cities, the skyscrapers are done differently. Let's take a look at our region of Central Europe, formerly part of the communist Eastern Bloc, and see how skyscrapers were built around here and what they meant in the city. In the virtual city of Altengrad down here, I will completely clear a rather run-down area behind one of the train stations to start the skyscraper district. For the longest time, the absolute tallest structures in Europe were churches. Already in 1311, in England, the Lincoln Cathedral's spire reached 160 meters, breaking even the modern definition of a skyscraper, which is 150. It lost its first place after long 238 years, not because a taller church was built, but because the spire collapsed. This record height was only broken by today's tallest church in the world, the Ulm Minster in Germany, completed in 1890, reaching just 1.5 meters higher to 161.5. The Central European regions were exactly the same when it comes to their tallest buildings throughout most of the 20th century, excluding antennas and broadcasting towers. Modern skyscrapers only took over churches in the second half of it, but, for example, in Hungary, a basilica remained the tallest building well into the 21st century, until 2022. Motivations for building skyscrapers were mainly two: need for very large floor space on very expensive land, or monumentality, a sort of a status symbol. Churches fell firmly into the second motivation, but modern skyscrapers into the first, although quite often overlapped in the second too, depending on the investor. This means that the very tall buildings started to pop up in city centers. Land was expensive there and lots of people will see the buildings, so it will promote the brand. However, European city centers were already full. Sometimes demolitions were possible, but even then, fitting a proper skyscraper was out of the question, let alone fitting multiple skyscrapers next to each other, thus kicking off a sort of height race like in New York. The big European cities, unlike New York, did not really need that rapid vertical expansion, and especially further east, were not really that rich to massively build them. Not to mention, there were already some historical protection laws in place or height restrictions to protect skylines, even in the late 1800s, and various other restrictions against those American-style skyscrapers. Europe was apparently also generally afraid of fire safety of super tall buildings for a long time. But some investors did manage to finance and get permits for unusually tall buildings. One of the very first such structures was finished in downtown Warsaw in 1908, the Post building, originally an office of a Swedish telecommunications company. It only had a very modest 11 floors and 51.5 meters, but it still made it the highest building in Europe, maybe somewhat starting the Polish fondness of building tall. It only remained the tallest for 3 years, though, until Western Europe took over. If we look at the building's position today, we see it's really nothing special, no special urbanism around it, it's just part of a city block, but it's slightly higher. That was very common. Very similar location and conditions for another, perhaps more famous Polish building, the Prudential House, finished in 1933. With its Art Deco style, maybe bringing a little bit of New York into downtown Warsaw. Both of these were heavily damaged during the war, but rebuilt not long after, somewhat symbolizing their viewed importance. Berlin also briefly became a city with the tallest building in Europe between 1926 and 29, with the Ullstein House. Here, the tallest part is a clock tower with 77 meters, while the rest of the building is considerably shorter. This building is certainly not in the city center, as it was also partially a factory, a printing house with offices. It is one of those late examples of some purposeful factory architecture, in this case brick expressionism, where the investors clearly wanted to make their place of business very representative. It is still built very much in a block fashion on a regular city street. But things started to change. This is the so-called Baťa skyscraper, the tallest building in Czechoslovakia, built in 1938. It's just a half a meter taller than the Berlin's Ullstein House, but at this point in time it was the second tallest in the entire Europe. It very much started to show the changes in urbanism, architecture, and engineering. It is a functionalist building done with more modern materials and very progressive reinforced concrete frame structural principle, while the filler walls are still made of standard bricks. Visually, it was way ahead of its time, since office high-rises will look like this for the next 50 years. But also urbanistically, it showed how cities will be structured in the rest of the 20th century according to the modernist principles. Blocks will be no more, especially unique buildings such as these will be freestanding in more monumental positions as part of some broader concept of a city district, which creates a somewhat third motivation for building tall, the modernist principles. So, building tall to completely turn around general city principles to free up as much surface area as possible to create a more airy, green, non-restricted surface space for people. But then, Second World War happened. Communists took over, removing free real estate market, therefore removing the money motivations for building tall in city centers, and centralizing urban planning, urban growth, or generally what gets built where. The Stalinist or Socialist realism architecture suddenly swept into Central Europe from the Soviet Union. Back in Moscow, several super tall Stalinist skyscrapers were built, where the absolute number one priority was monumentality. In 1953, the tallest building in Europe for a very long time became the Moscow State University with a whopping height of 240 meters, jumping up almost 2.5 times over the tallest building in Europe outside of Moscow at the time. Soon after, in 1955, the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw was finished, looking almost identical, yet being just 3 meters shorter. I'm sure that was not intentional at all, of course. The palace finally took over churches in height. Just 1 year after, in 1956, the tallest Czechoslovak building was built, the Hotel International, in the same style, but with only puny 88 meters in height, still shorter than the tallest Czech church. Socialist realism times ended quickly, and modernist architecture and urbanism once again took over, so it was time for the modern high-rises. I'm going to now stop with listing just about every new tall building in Central Europe. Let's now more focus on how were they built and what was their purpose in a city. The monumentality inside the overall layout combined with a bit of a status symbol principles were dominating the high-rise motivations. That is exactly why, from this time period, there is pretty much non-existent respect for continuing heights. Tall buildings are right next to short ones. High-rises are on the edges of cities, almost in the middle of nowhere sometimes, but nicely seen from all angles, so that sort of thing. A small Hungarian city of Szolnok shows this perfectly. The city was heavily damaged during the Second World War, so conveniently creating space for rebuilding, which is pretty much a prerequisite for finding tall buildings near city centers around here these days. These two are identical prefab residential towers placed clearly in visually important locations, both as part of larger residential projects. One is at this intersection. One is acting as almost a castle tower overlooking the edge of the city. So clearly, their purpose is not to provide more flats in a tight and expensive area. In the city center, there is a more unique high-rise, as the location is more important, and similarly by the train station, creating again a visual monument at the large square in a very deliberate combination with the shorter structures. They are certainly not mega skyscrapers, but rather common modernist towers to pierce those otherwise uniform heights. On one hand, there is that higher degree of planned, larger city parts according to some common visual idea. On the other hand, is that idea actually resulting in a good living environment? The actual skyscrapers pushing those height limits of countries were, during the communist times, either luxury hotels, universities, headquarters of the prestigious foreign trade companies, or state media offices. Therefore, again, the monumentality and visual principle dominated the motivations. Therefore, those tall buildings are found not in the usual spots, but in the visually important spots. That is exactly the case in Prague. We have seen the Congress Center before. Right next to it is the Corinthia Hotel, completing the modernist combination of tall, short, and massive roads. A little further is the place of Prague's tallest buildings. The first was the Motokov Tower, today called City Empiria. This building perfectly illustrates the times. Motokov Car Export Company and a few others suddenly lost their headquarters due to a fire, so the government simply decided that new prestigious buildings will be built for them. These export companies were absolutely vital for the economy and the ruling regimes. The Motokov Tower was designed in 6 weeks and built in just under 3 years by a filthy capitalist Italian construction company using very expensive materials and technologies because at the time they were unavailable in the Eastern Bloc. So when the party decided, things simply moved forward. The tower finished in 1977, sitting at 104 meters, just overtaking the tallest church and becoming the tallest Czechoslovak building for 2 decades. This time, the urbanists were a little worried that the skyscraper, built also on one of the tallest places in Prague, is just too much of a disruption to the historical panorama. The solution? More skyscrapers. The very originally named City Tower started to be built in 1985, originally as headquarters of the Czechoslovak radio. For this building, the ruling regime also simply decided for things to happen, but by the late 80s they ran out of steam, so this time the building took long 8 years to finish, and by that time the Czech radio did not even want it, as it was too obsolete, so it was quickly sold off. Once again, it was the tallest Czech building for 2 decades. This place then sparked the very common trend in most European cities, which is the formation of a cluster of skyscrapers further away from the historical downtown, creating or attempting a sort of financial or business downtown. This can be seen in much more famous places, for example in London, Paris, or Vienna more closely. In the once again free real estate market, the placement of such buildings would have to make sense economically. The monumentality thing was clearly still present, but unless the building paid for itself, it wouldn't matter. City restrictions, of course, play a major role by allowing or not allowing such clusters. But the modernist visual monumentality, the idea of tying together larger city projects with a combination of short and tall, is gone. Just like the overall bigger planning picture, from now on the individual buildings would pop up for different reasons. If the plot allows it and it's a lucrative position, then let's build as tall as possible. On the other hand, Warsaw's city center quickly became a sort of American downtown, starting with modern skyscrapers by the late 90s. Even though this was already 50 years after the Second World War, the destruction still left many empty spots or brownfields. So, unlike Budapest, Prague, Bratislava, or even Berlin, there were plenty of opportunities for 21st century rebuilds. The Palace of Culture and Science, massively overshadowing everything nearby, must have clearly played a role in decisions to complement its panorama. Clearly, it would not make much sense to restrict heights when there already is a massive 237-meter tall megastructure right in the center of it. The palace was finally overtaken in 2022 by the Warsaw Tower with 310 meters. But still, unlike New York or various other American or Asian downtowns, the skyscrapers are not clustered into a couple of well-defined areas. They are actually rather sparse. with many short buildings between them, which is a sort of remnant of the previous rebuilds of Warsaw. This allows the individual skyscrapers to breathe more, be more visible, have better view, but on the other hand, it creates a very uneven form. Which approach is the best to building tall? Well, once again, it depends on exactly where you are, what projects are you looking at, and how they make you feel. Let's now take a look at the big changes that are happening down here in our city. The scale of today's project was actually kind of accidental because, as you could have seen in the time-lapse, I was not really sure about the buildings that I'm going to place in here, so I did the usual thing. I just created a palette of all the available buildings that even remotely could be possible for this project, and then I just started test fitting them. Right from the beginning, it was really obvious that I want to use this Berlin zoo something building that I don't remember exactly how it's called. And well, because it's the shape. Again, you know me, I really like buildings that don't have the rectangular shapes because it just looks like they are purpose built for that specific location. So if you can perfectly fit them into some kind of geometry, it really creates that much more realistic feel that the building was specifically designed for this spot. That's obviously a problem in city skylines because we do it the other way around. We already have the buildings and then we need to fit them into the city. So, you know, I do it all the time. I tend to just do more regular geometry so that I can fit the more regular buildings. But every chance I get, every chance I can, I'm just going to do these non-standard geometries because, like I said, it's just spicing it up. So yeah, that was absolutely obvious. Unfortunately, that building was only looking great instead of the bus station that was in here. I was not planning on demolishing the bus station. I was even planning on doing some kind of refurbishments to it in the 80s maybe, or in the 90s or something like that. So this was a rather surprising decision, but it was not exactly all that super far-fetched either, because I am planning on pushing the buses more away from the city center. But I don't really want to give you too many spoilers with this, because I do have specific projects in mind attached to some, bus station terminal projects. So yeah, no spoilers. Well, anyways, the bus station had to go, and instead of it, there is that one skyscraper, and it must not be alone, so I decided to just put some other skyscrapers in here. They're not like super tall skyscrapers that you can download from the workshop, but as we could have seen, European cities, Central European cities are not exactly known to have these, so it would be just really weird to have like something 10 times higher than the neighboring buildings. So this will do. This is actually perfect. And this is not going to be the only place with skyscrapers in the city. It actually somewhat ties to that bus moving, or the moving of the bus station. But like I said, no spoilers. Well, anyways, so we finally have these 4 structures, if I count right. Yes, 4. And it's probably going to have more, this place, because right now it's like half is finished, half is a construction site. Some of the original depot, the train depot, is not demolished just yet, because I really did not want to commit to this place fully. And actually that has a reason, because this place is supposed to show the progression of architecture and principles and something. So these skyscrapers or buildings are supposed to look more like the 2000s. So we obviously have the Zieleniak building, that's the green building by the river, that's from the 70s in Altengrad, the real-life Polish building, high-rise, not really sure if you can call it a skyscraper. Then we have the 90s extension of the train station, and in the 2000s, the skyscrapers. Now, as you can see already in the cinematics, it's not just the skyscrapers that I changed around here, but there's the construction site, of course, which is going to have, again, no spoilers, but there's going to be one major infrastructure change in that area. I already indicated a sort of pedestrian underpass under this entire railway, place that is otherwise very difficult to cross. There is also the rework of those arches, which were formerly a retaining wall. Yes, the cinematics are coming to them right now. So those are going to actually, well, this is going to be a spoiler, but I'm going to say it. These are going to house some commercial floors, commercial areas. I was kind of sort of inspired by some refurbishments of similar bridge arches in Prague recently, but also the waterfront in Prague houses, similar styled commercial places. So that's going to look nice here together with that underpass that you can see right there. The bridge, the railway bridge here needs to be refurbished. It needs to be widened. I was also off camera doing some like gameplay-wise changes to the tracks. Otherwise, these terminus stations don't really work very well in city skylines. So, and I also changed the ballast texture. Unfortunately, in city skylines, you can only have one texture for mud or dirt and the ballast under the tracks. So, unfortunately, I'm just going to have one texture for all, but I just wanted to modernize it a little. So there is that. And also, there is the extension of that pedestrian street coming from that 90s extension of the train station. So that's also looking a little bit more like the 2000s, more like Berlin 2000s. I mean, I was using Berlin buildings in here, so that makes sense. Anyway, guys, that is going to be all for today. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, then you know what to do below it. Thank you so much for the channel members who are directly supporting this channel and me in what I'm doing. Greatly appreciated, guys. Thank you again. Take care. Goodbye.